This is Future Fork, a show that explores the world of food and the decisions we can make today that will shape our future. On the show, you'll hear from innovators in the food space. We'll have disruptive conversations with people from around the globe who are taking the lead on topics like food sustainability, ending world hunger, food security, and so much more. I'm your host, Paul Newnham. In this episode, we're talking to Dr. Fabrice DeClerck, Chief Science Officer at EAT and Senior Scientist with the Alliance of Biodiversity and EAT of the CGIAR. In today's chat, we're exploring how science can guide the transformation of our global food system to benefit both people and planet. You'll hear about the landmark EAT-Lancet report and its impact on policy, why food systems hold the key to solving multiple global challenges, and why transformative changes are needed to feed a growing population sustainably. Let's get into it. Fabrice, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. It's an honor. Privilege. Good to see you again.
It's absolutely great. We're here in Italy and it's beautiful outside. It's a little wet, but it's a great day. So you're the Chief Science Officer at EAT and a Senior Scientist with the Alliance for Biodiversity and EAT at the CGIAR. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means and how did you get to these roles?
So I've long been interested in the intersection between environment and health. Go way, way back. Actually, as a senior in high school, there's a group of Belgians that came into school and said, we're looking for volunteers to ride their bikes from Brussels to Merzouga in Morocco. And I remember going home and saying, Mom's crazy group came over and she said, well, why don't you do it? And so did it. And then we had every kilometer sponsored. So 4,000 kilometers between Brussels and Merzouga in Morocco, every kilometer sponsored. And then went to Burkina Faso and worked with a small NGO that was working on small catchment systems. And we did some reforestation. And I remember planting trees in the field and having a farmer come by and say, what are you guys doing? And giving him the classic spiel on desertification and climate change. And the fellows saying, okay, and starting to weed the same field where we were planting eucalyptus. And I think just really realizing then, one, that I found this interesting, two, that it felt as though we were missing a greater understanding of the environmental science behind this and the social sciences behind it as well. Why this farmer? Why this field? Why eucalyptus? And I think that just led me on this trajectory that was about trying to understand the intersection between environmental health and agricultural health. That later on became a collaboration. I was doing my postdoc at Columbia with Jess Fanzo and Jeff Sachs and that whole mafia. Then forced me to think about, well, what role does ecology have in the Millennium Development Goals at the time before the SDGs with the MDGs? And Jeff Sachs just challenging us, say, you ecologists, what's your contribution? What are you guys going to do? And began to collaborate with nutritionists, Jess Fanzo, Cheryl Palm as an agronomist, and found that the intersection between environmental health, human health, social health, and the role that agriculture and food plays in the middle as being this really fascinating and impactful spot to focus on. So little by little, worked 7 years in Costa Rica with cattle farmers, coffee farmers, all on sustainability and health. I moved to the CGIAR, the Alliance of Biodiversity and EAT, as you mentioned, whose main mandate is agricultural biodiversity. And I think there, the big push was recognizing that if you want farmers to produce a diversity of foods, you have to have consumers consuming diversity of foods. So that link between the two became quite fundamental. And eventually, met Johan Rockström at the CGIAR, and he said, well, you need to meet Gunhild, come to EAT. I was fascinated by Gunhild's energy, by this impatience that she has, and found that to EAT was just the right spot for me to be able to continue this work at the intersection with an impatient boss wanting radical impact, but also recognizing the value of collaborating across food system actors to drive change. So that was in 2016. I'm still working for both, and I don't think I've done anything more productive in my life than what we've done with EAT over the past 8 years.
So when you talk about day-to-day in a job like this, you've got obviously two jobs, and you're working in balancing, I guess, research and science with policy influence and really driving change. And how does that work? What does that look like day to day?
So day to day, the parts of all of this is about managing communities. And so, the commission, EAT doesn't have a team of scientists. We work through other knowledge institutions, Cornell University for our modeling work, Harvard leads our nutrition work, Potsdam for Climate leads the environment work, Stockholm Resilience Center on Transformation. We work with the journal The Lancet to identify what are really cutting edge, established scholars in food systems, looking across health, environment, justice, transformation. And what I've really enjoyed about that is the need to be able to bring people who maybe have never interacted before into a space to work on a common challenge, but to be able to identify what their discipline brings to that challenge. But in particular, looking for individuals who are capable of bringing their perspective, but with sufficient modesty to listen to others and work on that integration. That's how we do both the commissions, but also, I think, by extension, the way that at EAT we're trying to work both on the action side. So my role is really trying to develop the knowledge for the commission. How do we use that to drive action? And I think that one of the spaces that I've found to be the most exciting at EAT has been the exposure to work with cities, to work with the private sector, to work with farmers, to work with indigenous communities. And as a scientist, not just provide knowledge, but to gain knowledge through that interaction, to listen to the challenges, to understand what frontline actors are trying to do, and to create spaces at EAT where knowledge and action can interact to help drive change. So much of my day-to-day is about trying to build community, drive the development of the commission, but more than anything, what is it that we're hearing from the food system community that goes back into our knowledge products? What are the questions that we need to answer as scientists if we're going to make a meaningful contribution to this change we're looking for?
So EAT-Lancet report was a big report that came out. I happened to be at the launch and obviously know a lot and have partnered with the community in many ways. But for anyone who doesn't know, what is this report? And tell me a little bit about why has this report been so influential?
Yeah, sure. So the EAT-Lancet Commission first came out in 2019. We started working on it in 2016. At the time, really innovative because we brought the environmental science community and the health communities that were interacting with each other together and drove them to ask, three big questions. What is a healthy diet? What are the environmental limits of food production? Can you feed 10 billion people by 2050 within environmental limits? And so that was the main challenge. So it set normative, if you want, measures that allow people to understand what's healthy in terms of both energy level, but also food composition, understand how countries and actors are performing based on that consumption, gave guidance then on how far and how fast communities need to go to come back within healthy, what the impacts of that transition would be on health, but also I think most quite importantly, demonstrated that there's a strong alignment between environmental health and human health, and that if we can move towards healthy diets, we have significant impact on coming back within planetary boundaries.
And as part of that, there was an introduction of what's called the planetary health diet. So can you tell me a little bit about what does this mean and why does it matter?
So the planetary health diet, and a lot of debates around that name. The planetary health diet, or the public health diet, if you would prefer, looks a lot like most food-based dietary guidelines that you might see in your home country, but it's a recommendation on the amount of food, or amount that people should have access to. And more importantly, I think, in terms of the ranges of recommended consumption for each of these food groups. So in the first commission, we talked about 2,500 calories per day per person as a global goal, making sure that everyone everywhere has access to that amount. Yeah, we recognize that if you're a man or a woman or a child, or if you're exercising more or less, that value will change. But globally, we want to make sure that that's the amount that everyone has access to. And then the second part is food quality, which is how you would distribute those across food groups. So we talk about 30% of that energy coming from grains, whole grains preferably. We're very clear that, rice, maize, wheat if you want, but why not sorghum? Why not millet? Why not teff? There's a whole set of grains that are compatible. We recommend minimum consumption of fruits and vegetables, so 200 to 300 for fruits, I think it's 400 to 600 for vegetables. I'll have to look up those numbers again later to remind them. And then for the animal source proteins, the recommendation, I prefer to use weekly values, is 0 to 200 grams per week for red meat, 0 to 420 grams per week of poultry, 0 to 700 grams per week of fish. And then for the legumes, beans and pulses at 0 to 175 grams per day. And what's important in those is that there's huge flexibility, right? Those zero values are clear. If you want to be vegan, you want to be vegetarian, great evidence that you can be healthy. If you want to be an omnivore, great evidence that you can also be healthy. But as soon as you begin to come out of range for those food groups, the risk of a diet-related disease, whether it's malnutrition and hunger, or whether it's disease-related obesity and overweight, become important. And so it's really trying to give guidance in terms of amounts and distribution of those foods across food groups that the Commission tried to emphasize, and what we call the planetary health diet.
And so the planet element of this, so you've talked about the human health element. The planetary side of this is, how does that stack up then in terms of the impacts on planet and the elements there?
Yeah, that's been a major source of, I think, confusion with many of our partners. So the planetary part, it recognizes that too many of us are over-consuming, particularly over-consuming foods that have high environmental footprints, animal source proteins, meats, red meat in particular, but that if you transition towards a healthy diet, and you look towards 10 billion people on the planet in 2050, bringing consumption back into healthy, avoiding transgressions to overconsumption in developing economies, that this has significant reduction in environmental impacts, allows us to come back within a climate boundary, allows us to produce food without expanding into intact ecosystems, allows us to produce food without polluting waters with nitrogen and phosphorus.
So that was 2019. We're fast forward to 2025 and EAT-Lancet 2.0 is coming out. Tell us a little bit about why a second edition, what's evolved since the first report, and what are some of the challenges that you're really trying to address in this report?
So 5 years later, we felt that was a good time to review new evidence. Since we published in 2019, I know some of you are following, social media likes and TikTok ratings. For us as scientists, number of citations is our currency. EAT-Lancet Commission has been cited 12,000 times, which is astronomical number. Many of our papers get cited 100 times, 200 times. It's ranked as one of the most cited papers in the history of science, in the top 1%. So that means it's a whole set of new science that has come out since the Commission that we felt we needed to review, understand, and reintegrate into the report. So we felt it's time to review that, reevaluate whether there's new evidence on healthy diet, reevaluate how we can communicate better the diversity of global diets that fit within it. In the first commission, we reviewed 5 planetary boundaries. This time, we review all 9 planetary boundaries. And then also realized there were some things that we didn't talk about in the first commission that many of the actors that we work with found important, justice being one of them. What does this mean for farmers? What does this mean for poor, marginalized communities? What does overconsumption mean from a justice point of view? So a whole new section in the report that's now focusing on justice. The fourth thing that I think was important is that in the first commission, we had fantastic collaborations with Marco Springman, a tremendous modeler, one static model that we used to a lot of our analysis. This time around, we have Marco's model, but 10 additional global models. And so really trying to replicate how IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, works and bring together a modeling community to all run the same analyses and better understand where do we have confidence as a scientific community in terms of our understanding of system transformation. How do we need to adapt and improve those models if we're going to be able to provide further advice and evidence as we move forward? And so really building out a modeling community that's now both giving us better information on variance and confidence, but also, I think, maybe a bit subversively, getting 10 modeling groups now prepared to do this kind of analysis. We really expanded the capacity of the global community to do this kind of analysis.
So in looking at what came out of this, what's one thing or a few things that really surprised you?
In terms of the second commission, I think that not surprised by the new evidence on diet. That's remained quite stable. I think it's important for the food community to feel confident that what we recommend in 2019 remains largely the same. Where I think I'm more surprised is the planetary boundaries work. We've assessed all 9. The planetary boundaries community talks about 6 planetary boundaries that are transgressed: climate, biodiversity, land, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water. 5 of those transgressions are driven by the food system. So how we produce food, where we produce it, what foods we're consuming in what quantities, how much we lose in weight is the biggest driver of environmental transgression.
Tell me more. What's environmental transgression?
Environmental transgression means going past the planetary boundaries, right? So for us, one of our boundaries is land boundaries. So wanting to make sure that we keep at least 50% of all natural ecosystems intact. The food system is the primary conversion of land from biodiversity loss. 80% of biodiversity loss comes from food. 90% of pollution from nitrogen and phosphorus comes from food. And so those are where we need food system actions that bring us back within, what Johan Rockström and the Planetary Boundaries Group would say a safe operating space for environment.
What are you hopeful and encouraged by in what you see?
What I'm most hopeful and encouraged by what I see is that when you look at the planetary health diet, even though people, when they first hear about it, say, oh my gosh, that's radical. When you actually dive into it, it's pretty banal in terms of asking people to open themselves to a diversity of foods, fruits, nuts, vegetables, legumes, pulses, whole grains. These are not mystery ingredients. There is no lack of technology or lack of knowledge that stops us from making this transition, for one. 2, that if I look to most environmental solutions, we often are concerned about, what does this mean in terms of limiting my availability or access to enjoy life? No evidence that any of this limits your capacity to enjoy. If anything, it's a celebration of diversity. It's an encouragement to seek deliciousness, to share food with your family, to share food with friends, but to do that in a conscientious manner that recognizes that this act that we do 3 times a day has significant environmental impacts globally that scale up to the globe when you think about 10 million people, but also really deep individual impact. What you eat is the first source of health for individuals. So it's something that's good for the individual, also being good for the planet. I don't know of many solutions that allow you to have that double win.
You've talked a bit about the diversity of solutions because, is there a one size fits all, or is this something that the world is very diverse? There's lots of different cultures and you've worked in those cultures. Is there a particular way we need to be doing things or a particular thing we need to be eating, or have we got a bit of creativity to bring into this?
Huge scope for creativity. So the one size fits all, if you want, is eat a healthy diet, improve productivity, reduce food loss and waste. How do you do that? Sky's the limit for innovation. Whether you're a Mexican whose traditional diet is rice, beans, squash, maize, chilies, culantro, infinite recombination of those ingredients. And I think, the Mexican diet, the Thai diet, the Indian diet, in addition to the Mediterranean diet, are all fantastic examples. What we find encouraging is I can't find a single culture where there aren't ingredients from that culture that I wouldn't be able to recombine into something that would be healthy. So the scope for innovation, the scope for enjoyment really is limitless from my point of view.
What do you think is going to be the biggest barrier for us to bring about this change?
The biggest barrier for change is the lock-in from vested interests. I think there are people and economies that are built around today's food system that are afraid of this change, who of course would lose an economic interest. That's where I see the biggest barrier. On the flip side, the economic opportunities are equally large. And so it's how do you create space, give oxygen to those groups that I think have a real opportunity to be drivers of change, as you would have said as well, that I'd like to put more focus on. And I think the second piece to that is how do we find the means by which we're able to break down some of these lock-ins? send clear signals on the necessary change, be strict on the need for that change, while at the same time, I think being very humane about recognizing that these are people's livelihoods, this is people's well-being, it's people's families, and wanting to make sure that we care for those people who will have to make the biggest change in their daily lives.
So feeding 10 billion people a healthy diet is possible within these planetary boundaries, is what I'm understanding. You've been able to find a way through in science. As somebody who's sitting there looking at this, what's something they should be thinking about in the way that they can contribute to doing their part within this diet and this space?
I think one of the real strengths of the planetary health diet is its capacity to be interpreted at the individual level. Every individual in the food choice that you make on a daily basis has power. So there already, I would hope that that your audience would think a bit more conscientiously about what am I eating? Why am I eating it? What does it mean for me? And can I celebrate that food choice that I'm making? Also, has an impact on people elsewhere. When you were a kid, your parents told you, finish your plate, there are people starving in other parts of the world. I think the message now is think about what you're eating. There are people who are being impacted by how we eat, particularly in high-income countries, right? So our overconsumption of food not only is impactful on our own diets, but it drives deep environmental change, and that environmental change is felt by people who often are from much more marginalized communities, less access to healthcare, less access to responses to climate change. And I think that what I hope one of the main messages from the Commission will be is that healthy food is not just a right. Talk a lot about the right to food, but I hope that this message of healthy diets being a responsibility also emerges. And I think that the notion that our responsibilities supersede our rights is one of the messages that I hope comes through with this commission and begins to be at least wrestled with by many.
By looking at both the health and the planetary side, you're looking at a system and it changes that need to happen at a system level. In terms of the commissioners and the people, so commissioners are the scientists, I guess, that are working on this. They're coming from so many different walks of life. They're coming from different cultures. Tell us a little bit about how did you select these scientists for EAT-Lancet 2.0?
Yeah, fantastic group of scientists. So we have 3 categories, right? We have, 4 categories if we include our co-chairs, right? 3 co-chairs, Johan Rockström, who's a brilliant environmental scientist, Walter Willett at Harvard, brilliant health scientist, Shakuntala Tilsted, won the World Food Prize several years ago, brilliant agronomist, particularly focusing on aquatic systems. 20 commissioners, supported by 10 postdoctoral research fellows. We call these our youth scholars, if you want. So most of them are in their between 20 and 30, and then additional 40 scientists providing support. The Lancet asks us to identify 20 or so commissioners. They're looking for people who have very established careers, who have been working on primary data collection, primary analysis on one or more of the domains covered by the commission. Healthy diets, behavior change, environmental change, agriculture, and agronomy, and then social justice were the main domains that we were looking for. So we we initially had a list of 600 names that we went through. So spent quite a bit of time both scouring the literature, consulting with groups to identify, who were some of these most critical voices, presented 100 names to our leadership team, Johan, Walter, Shakuntala, Linnae Gordon, each of whom was leading a group, and asked them to pick, who were the 5 or so that they wanted in that team. We're looking for people who are experts in the field, but looking for people who at the same time would be prepared to work across domains. So, really people who are inquisitive, who are value-driven, but also who are prepared to be challenged on an idea and to explore, I think, what that interaction space is. And that takes a quite unique set of traits for the group. And I think we really hit the nail on the head with the group that we have today.
And so taking the recommendations from this diverse group, very well qualified, that have validated the evidence, you're now moving into how do you drive change? So what's been the approach of the connection between the science and the policy side and also the action side?
This is an area that fascinates me. So when you asked at the beginning, what's my day to day? So my other day to day has been working on what we call science policy interfaces, IPCC, or its sister organization, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And I think that these panels have been fantastic, but my concern is that science is a bit too distant from frontline actors. And I think there's a bit of a tradition as scientists that, we go off and hide and we write our report for 5 years and we do this handoff to policy or handoff to other actors and say, there you go, here's our science, get to work, we're expecting your results. I think that for me, one of the pieces that excites me the most about working at EAT has been saying, well, let's challenge that model. And how do we as scientists need to change our own behaviors in order to be more impactful? And for me, that comes through recognizing that science needs to be a bit closer to frontline actors. Yes, we need to be able to produce the best, independent, unbiased, peer-reviewed science possible. But I think we need to better understand what are the challenges of the farming community, of retail and manufacturers, of chefs, restaurants, of food service workers. And I think, what we've been doing in anticipation of this new commission coming out is working with those communities to facilitate their capacity to articulate, understand by the commission, but also articulate, what would it mean for a farmer? What would it mean for a restaurant? What would it mean for a retailer to contribute to this transition? And that interaction between science and action, and recognizing that my role then changes as a provider of knowledge to the commission to a recipient of knowledge by engaging these communities. And through that listening and engagement, being able to already think about what does the next EAT-Lancet Commission need to provide? What are the needs of these communities? How are we communicating a change? What are the kinds of interventions and actions that these communities are working on? And how can we as scientists be really clear about the urgency and the scale of change that's necessary, but also better understand, what are the opportunities to drive change? That interaction between knowledge and action, I find to be an absolutely fascinating space, and where I hope that science will transform itself in order to contribute better to that change.
In your career, is there a place where you've seen that interaction happen and the impact be profound?
When I first came to EAT, I remember sitting in a room with cities. It was the Milan Urban Policy Pact and C40 cities. And the cities were speaking to the intervention that they were putting in place. And they were being completely authentic in terms of saying, we tried to implement a community garden. And Los Angeles, would say, that example from Copenhagen on school meals, that was a fantastic example. We couldn't do that in LA because, Los Angeles isn't responsible for school meals, but we transformed it and we adapted it to our capacity within stadiums, within prison systems. And so to hear cities talk about what worked, what didn't work, how they adapted it, emphasized, how when we talk about solutions, there are broad-scale solutions, but they need to be adapted to context, the place, and to be able to have that authentic conversation on how did we adapt it, what worked, what didn't work, what stopped us from being more ambitious. I found those conversations as a scientist to be completely different from what we had discussed the day before as a scientific community. What's the cool research question? What's going to get us into nature or science? And so that privilege of being in the room with the cities to understand what their needs were, to understand what they were excited by, I felt was the development of that space.
So we're talking about food. I know you enjoy food a lot. So talk to me a little bit about a food memory that's really stood out to you in your life that kind of helps give you passion and drive to really continue to work in this space.
One food memory, maybe illustrate your first question, was in 4th grade in Los Angeles. We were asked to bring a food to school that represented our culture. So I went home and asked Mom, what should I take? And she gave me a jar of pickled herring. I wasn't very popular at school the next day. And I went back and said, Mom, we have fries, we have chocolate, we have waffles, and you gave me pickled herring. So maybe she was actually anticipating that, we would propose that blue foods, mussels and herring are actually a nice environmental solution as well as a healthy food. So maybe she was anticipating what I'd be doing many, many years later. I think for me, the memories that I think drive this kind of change most for me would be the year I spent with Mayan farmers in Yucatan doing my master's in the 90s, and they're going into their fields, understanding the milpa system, which is maize, beans, and squash, sharing meals every evening, and realizing that many of the foods they were eating are exactly what we're talking about now, and that the culinary culture of these people is a good example of what it is that we should be and could be eating. At the same time, in that same village, there was a little store in the corner. And if you go to that store, what was available in one of the most remote Mayan villages was sugar-sweetened beverages, right? It was sodas and then crisps. And so this dual interplay between being in a very traditional culture and seeing, what was on offer, I think really helped me to realize that there's a real value in being able to maintain traditions, to adapt and modernize those, to bring them into our lives, to share traditions across communities, but also a warning about recognizing that many of the new foods that we're producing are not contributing either to health and environment, and wanting to make sure we put in the right safeguards for that.
Well, Fabrice, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
My pleasure, Paul. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Future Fork, a show that explores the world of food and the decisions we can make today that will shape our future. Future Fork is produced by Disruptive Consulting Solutions and supports the SDG2 Advocacy Hub. For more info, head to the website futureforkpodcast.com. This show was produced with strategy and production support from Wavelength Creative. So you don't miss an episode of Future Fork, make sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Paul Newnham, and I'll see you in the next episode.